Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at this, which I believe is the third session of Cyber Secure South, which is led by Taylormade, our own tech specialist, which is fortunate because our projector wasn't quite working this morning, so we had one hand to unplug it and plug it back in. That seemed to do the job. We began talking about Cyber Secure South well over a year ago when there was a great deal of fear-mongering and confusion and quite often misleading information going out about issues such as cybersecurity, how you can have insurance against the cost of rectifying a cyber attack, the increasingly impending challenge of the Gdpr, the General Data Protection Regulation, and also awareness, the importance of training and being aware of the different types of cyber attacks, spear phishing, and so on, that you need to train your staff on, because it doesn't matter, and I think even Taylormade will agree, it doesn't matter how good your tech is, the number one weakness in any cybersecurity system are people. Not careless, not negligently, just because in a very, very busy lives, in a busy working day with sophisticated, psychologically devised spear phishing exercises, infiltration into people's private life through their Facebook accounts, and done on a massive scale, it is very, very easy for someone to quite innocently and with paying all due care and attention to make that fatal mistake which allows someone into your system. So, my name is Mark O'Halloran. I'm the Head of Commercial Services and a partner here at Coffin Mew, and I will be coming back a bit later to hopefully give you a not too heavy intro into what the General Data Protection Regulation is all about. We also have Matthew Faulkner from Taylormade, who's going to be talking about the key issue of preventative measures. Tim Jeffcott from Datto, who's going to give you some quite exciting cyber attack demonstrations. I've seen this stuff before, it's great fun, as long as you're not on the receiving end of it. And Simon Dixon from Portmore, who will be talking to you about the insurance options and the very affordable insurance options which are available to help you deal with the rectification of a cyber attack. So without more ado, as I say, I'll hand over to Matthew.
Thanks, Mark. Morning, everyone. As Mark said, I'm going to talk about the preventative measures for cybersecurity today, but before I do that, I just want to give you a bit of background on Taylormade, perhaps for those who don't know us. So we are an IT solutions provider. We provide a number of services, typically to businesses around the South Coast, from business-aligned IT strategy through to proactive support, design and implementation services. I've listed... Call me out there, Mark. I've listed a few of the recognitions that we've received in recent months, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to touch on a few. And the first one, which I'm particularly proud of, we have been recognised as one of the top IT managed service providers in the UK, 4th in the UK, 6th in EMEA. We're investors in People Gold with champion status, and one of the accreditations that we've recently acquired in the last 18 months, very relevant today, ISO 27001 Information Security Management System. And all this is backed by a group of highly qualified people, both technical and non-technical, with our sort of main vendors, Microsoft, VMware, Cisco, and so on and so forth. As I say, we provide our services across a range of different customers, not specialising in any one particular sector. Coffin Mew of most note today, where we provide the majority of our services from on-site IT support, as well as delivering services out of our data centre. For bespoke desktop as a service. But there are a few other names there which I'm sure you'll recognise. Bewley, one of our most long-standing customers of over 20 years now. Portsmouth NHS, Southern Co-op, just to name a few. So before we start talking about the preventative measures for cyber crime, I thought it would be really good just to start with what cyber crime actually is. And I've defined it up here as an individual or organised group who are really seeking to extract money, get access to your commercially sensitive information, or in some other way cause disruption to your business. And the UK government estimated that the global cost of cybercrime last year was $450 billion, which is just an absolutely extraordinary figure. So where's this threat coming from? We have to recognise that the greatest threat is coming from outside of our organisations. And I say this based on really simple maths and statistics. I'm willing to bet there are more people outside your organisation than are working inside your organisation. And these come in two groups. You've got professional hackers, those who are trying to actively target your organisation to get access to your information, cause disruption, extort money. But you also get the hobbyists. There's so much information out there today that you can read on the internet to get access to. There are tools that are very easy to access, some of which we might see later today, which allows people with reasonably low level of skill to really try their hand, knock on doors and see, if they can find an opening. And all of this is to exploit weaknesses in people, process and the technology that we wrap around it to protect ourselves. We shouldn't overlook, though, and Mark made the point fantastically at the beginning, we shouldn't overlook that there's a very real threat from people inside our organisation. And the reason for this is not because they necessarily go out with some sort of malicious intent. I'm sure we all look to employ people who have both got the capability to do the job, but also because they're trustworthy and they've got some integrity about them. But because people can be exploited, these people who have already got access to your commercially sensitive information, your account, your customer lists, your accounts information, your quoting engines, they become a backdoor into your infrastructure. So I thought I'd wrap some sort of context around this, just to kind of give some perspective. I think there's a real risk that we read information that we see in the media, and we see that a number of big organisations, large organisations, have been compromised. I mean, we've seen the NHS Trust recently who have been compromised. We've seen Equifax quite recently who have been compromised. And I think we can be lulled into a false sense of security to think this won't happen to us. So what I've done is I've pulled some information directly from our firewalls at Taylormade. And what you're looking at here is a map just showing sort of the sources of information or sources of the attacks. So over a period of an hour, we see approximately 1,300 attempts to access our network. We know this because we can pull the information directly from our firewalls and we can see what people are trying to do. If we extend that further over a 24-hour period, we can see that there's approximately 18,500 attempts on a daily basis to access our network. And we can take this one step further. We can actually not only see the number of attempts that people are making to access our network, but we can understand what they're trying to access. So we know they're trying to access our database services, our file systems, our email systems, our IP telephony systems. And when we take that one step further, we can also see where those attacks are coming from. Names that you probably would expect to see up there: Russia, United States, China, to name a few. So that brings me on nicely to what can we do to ensure that we prevent this. And the first thing that we really need to do is to understand the risk. And that is not understand the risk in terms of IT or technology, but understand the risk in the context of our business services that we provide. So this is something that we do as part of our ISO 27001. We have to identify what we classify as our business critical functions, and we have to attribute the risk to it. What if that goes offline? What would we then do? Once we understand what our risks are, we can then go about performing security assessments, and we can do this on a regular basis, targeting areas of risk and the areas of weakness to go through that continual improvement cycle. With 18,500 attempts to access our network on a daily basis, we really have to shift our thinking from if we are at risk of a security breach to when we experience a security breach. And that really focuses the mind. So we've already gone through a process of understanding what our risks are. Now, what are we going to do about it? It might be that we need to wrap extra layers of security around it. It might be that we need to wrap extra layers of resiliency around it. But what we really must do is we must have a business continuity plan. So if one of our key services goes offline, how can we continue to deliver services both internally to our staff, but also to our external customers who make use of our services on a day-to-day basis? And I quite agree with what Mark said at the beginning, which is people are a really important, if not the most important part of this process. And staff awareness really is the key to success. And you can do this in a number of different ways. Cybersecurity awareness training is a really good start. Defining a comprehensive set of IT policy documents, which I know doesn't sound immensely interesting, but it does give you a really broad set of do's and don'ts, which you can then use to educate your staff and set expectations about how they actually use the service which you provide. So we've talked a bit about people and process, but what about technology? So I've listed up here some of the basic technologies, and I do appreciate that these are basic technologies. But you would be surprised the number of organisations that we go into that don't have these really simple things in place. And without these simple things in place, you really are opening yourself up to more risk. So just to run through them, email filtering, anti-spam. Something in the order of 65% of all malware and ransomware is delivered by email. It's an absolutely fantastic mechanism for delivering ransomware, because people get attachments all the time and they get emails with URL links in all the time. And if you haven't got that awareness, you haven't got that people part in place, it's really easy for people to inadvertently click on those links, open those attachments, and having that email filtering in place helps reduce the risk that you're actually exposing your users to in the first place. Web content control. I read just this morning in the BBC, McAfee, a well-known antivirus provider, have reported that searches for Craig David on the web now have the greatest risk of you ending up on a site which is distributing malware. Web content control, super important, and it can really help mitigate those sorts of risks. And for those searching for Craig David, hopefully remain safe. Perimeter security, so firewalls. This is the first line of defence. This is the gateway in and out of your infrastructure as far as technology is concerned. Configured correctly, it can be an absolutely fantastic preventative measure. But if you leave a door open, then people can easily walk through. Antivirus, anti-malware. We see this as what we call a multi-level defence. And what we mean by that is we have antivirus running at multiple different levels throughout the IT or technology infrastructure, starting at what we call the gateway, so what's coming in and out of the network, whether that's running on the email filtering system, the web content control system, or with later firewall technologies, can actually run on the firewall itself. But you also run it on your servers and your desktops, and you really do need to make sure that A, you've got that you've got 100% coverage, but also that you have got those antivirus definitions up to date to ensure that, again, you're not opening yourself up to the more recent cyber attacks. The last thing I want to touch on here is password management, and I think this is in some respects an interesting topic because there is such a lot of different information around about password management. And for a long time there's been a general working principle that you should do things like have really complex passwords, have passwords for absolutely every service that you use, change those passwords on a frequent basis, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it may be. And of late, that working principle has changed on the basis that as we are only human, the more passwords that we have, the more complex they are, the more likely we are to circumvent our own security measures that we've got in place and write them down, put them on a post-it note, stick it onto the side of the monitor, which clearly contravenes what we're actually trying to achieve. GCHQ have released a white paper reasonably recently, probably in the last 18 months to 2 years on this. And it's worth a read. It's a very short document. There's only 7 or 8 points on there, and you can find it just by searching for GCHQ password security white paper. But the basis of what comes out in there is that you shouldn't have different passwords for absolutely every single service you use. You shouldn't change those passwords on a frequent basis, and you need to really balance the complexity and quantity with the actual usability from our people's perspective. They also recommend that you use what's called a constant vowel consonant construction, or CVC, as you sometimes see it abbreviated to. And using this construction means that you tend to have passwords which are easy to pronounce by virtue of the fact that you've got a vowel in the middle of 2 consonants. But also it's not based on a dictionary word, which increases your security no end. And the general recommended password length is between 10 and 12 characters. So the last thing that I wanted to go through today was just a bit of a reality check, really. And as I said earlier on in this presentation, I think there's a real risk that we get lulled into a false sense of security, that this only happens to big organisations that are obviously a target for some people. So what I wanted to do is just list a few examples of where we have been asked to go into organisations to actually remediate things or to prevent some things that had already happened. So the first example here, and almost certainly the worst that we have seen, is we were asked to go into an organisation who thought that they had been compromised, and indeed they had. They'd left a hole in their firewall, And attackers compromised that, and they managed to get onto servers which should have been on the safe side of that firewall. They should have been protected, they shouldn't have been accessible. However, they were, and those people conducting the attack started to get access to their commercially sensitive information. So, our role there was clearly to come in, lock it down, and to bring back some sort of state of normality. Fake emails requesting payment. I would be amazed if you haven't seen these, where organisations emails are coming in saying, this is the CEO, MD, FD, to the accounts department. Please, can you transfer some stupid sum of money, and it has to be done super urgently. You'd be amazed. People do get caught out by that. Again, people and awareness, as well as technology, is something that can help prevent that. Websites compromised. Mainly the Craig David ones, but we have seen other organisations where their websites have been targeted, and rather than providing the information about their particular business, all of a sudden they're distributing some form of malware or ransomware. And it wouldn't be right without talking a little bit about ransomware. And unfortunately, we do see this more than we would care to. And it only takes someone with a laptop, to maybe go home, browse around, read their personal emails. All of a sudden, they've got some ransomware on their laptop. They bring it into an organisation, maybe connect to a guest network, which is not properly, confined to guests. And all of a sudden, you've got organisations that data has been obscured, it's been encrypted, and it's inaccessible. So to summarise, people and process is a really key part of cybersecurity prevention. The technology that you can wrap around it works very, very well, but it has to go hand in hand with people and process. And if you are bringing on any new services, my recommendation is that security really has to be at the forefront of that activity, as opposed to an afterthought. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to Tim. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I think that both Matthew and Mark have actually already touched on several points I'm going to cover today, so they've actually made my job quite a bit easier. So some of the things that Mark mentioned, we're seeing an increasing threat from really within the whole realm of cybersecurity. There's an increasing threat on a number of different fronts, and today I'm going to show you one of those fronts, show it to you in action. But there's a couple of things that Mark said that I quite liked. He said that it's now very easy for even unskilled attackers to be able to get the tools they need to be able to attack you. And then something that Matthew mentioned is really just how straightforward it is for criminals to get what essentially is going to be classed as weapons of mass destruction. I mean, if you just look at the WannaCry attack that happened in May earlier this year and what that did to the NHS and to a large number of other organisations around the world, this is almost cyber warfare rather than just criminals. Now, unfortunately, in order to do a live demo, I'm going to have to plug my machine in rather than using the deck here. So just give me one moment to transfer this over. But really, what I'm going to talk about is to give you a bit of insight into some of the tools that are used by criminals to actually get their malicious payloads onto their victims' machines, and then a little bit more insight into actually what that looks like. So, how do you get infected? How do criminals get their malicious software onto your machine? Well, Matthew's already talked a bit about some of the attack vectors, so holes in firewalls, whether phishing scams and so on, and there's a few examples up on the screen here and some common methods that criminals use to get their malicious software onto their victims' machines. And it can be very, very simple things like emails. Masquerading as known, trusted people, whether it's a friend, whether it's an organisation that you know or trust, whether it's your bank, or regardless of who the criminals are choosing to impersonate, they try and trick their victims into running software on their machine. That could be an email attachment, it could be directing them to download an MP3 Craig David song, I don't know. But nevertheless, this is a very common attack vector. But we are seeing it being used less frequently. At end of 2015, beginning of 2016, this was used a lot to try and infect people. And generally, they were very targeted attacks. So criminals would spend several weeks researching their victims, looking at their LinkedIn profiles, looking at on their company websites, looking and so on. And if you look at any company website, you go to the About Me page, you can generally find out a reasonable bit of information about their board of directors, their names, maybe a bit of some of their company history. Then you can use that to look at LinkedIn, look at their CVs, and start to build up a picture of who that person is. And then you can start to try and look at the ways to compromise that person's methods of communication. We actually had a reported attack in our own organisation earlier this week where somebody was calling us up on the phone pretending to be our marketing director, trying to get the mobile number of our MD. And so somebody had researched our organisation enough to learn the name of our marketing director, and then they were trying to then get more information about our MD, maybe then to try and architect one of these spear phishing attacks where they would then create some kind of email that would then trick somebody into running their malicious software on their machine. We've also seen less sophisticated attacks. Criminals putting malicious software onto flash drives and leaving them in car parks, hoping that somebody's going to see it on the floor, pick it up, plug it in when they get into the office, and then be compromised. Again, less sophisticated, but it does happen. And certainly in the earlier days of these types of ransomware attacks, some of these perhaps less sophisticated but more highly targeted attacks were very common. And now, it's quite easy for us to identify that actually that Nigerian prince asking for money, that is just a scam. Or in fact that email that's masquerading to be from your finance director is in fact a scam. And that's why these types of attacks are starting to decrease in frequency. But what is scary is how easy it is for criminals to get these tools, to get these cyber weapons. This is a screenshot of an online store that uses a lot of the same techniques that you're familiar with in shopping on places like Amazon and eBay. So you can browse, and you might be able to see on the banner here, there's a range of different categories, and on the dark web there's a range of different things and services and products that are available. And traditionally it has been weapons and drugs, but now criminals can go to a common marketplace where they can buy essentially off-the-shelf ransomware attacks. And as you can see, it's quite affordable. I mean, what, $39? That's not a lot of money to be able to buy some of the ingredients you need to package it up into a ransomware attack. And so there are a lot of criminals now that essentially offer cyber warfare, cyber attacks as a service where you can subscribe to them and pay a monthly fee, and then they will update the latest software for you and provide you with the ingredients that you need to actually start attacking your victims. And so this type of marketplace is available on what we call the dark web. So you can't just go to Google and type in ransomware, please. There's certain methods that criminals are now starting to share that allows them to actually access these. And it's becoming increasingly easy to be able to remotely and anonymously get these types of ingredients, these types of tools that you can then put together into a ransomware attack. And that's exactly what happened earlier this year with WannaCry back in May. There was a specific piece of software that had been stolen from the NSA that was then bundled with ransomware that then allowed this attack to spread so widely around the world. And I mentioned a bit earlier that these types of spear phishing attacks and email attacks and flash drives and car parks, we haven't seen many of those attacks this year in 2017 because the game has changed. And WannaCry was so devastating because it did not rely on human error to spread. It used some of these stolen tools from the NSA to spread from one machine to another without any human beings double-clicking on anything, without any emails or anything like that. So criminals are now finding ways to spread their attacks that don't rely on human error. Now, don't get me wrong, the vast majority of ransomware attacks to most businesses here in the UK still occur through human error by somebody clicking on that email attachment or following that link. But I said criminals are constantly moving the game forward. So what can you do to protect yourself? If having multiple layers of security is essential, but criminals are always going to try and find ways around those. And these are just a few examples of the WannaCry attack that took place in May. And the reason why a lot of these massive organizations were compromised wasn't because they had bad IT security. Most of these organizations had state-of-the-art IT security and did have all that level of training. But because criminals are constantly moving the game forward, it becomes very difficult to try and predict what is going to happen in 2018 and in 2019. What is going to be the latest attack that's going to come. And whilst it's obviously vital to have as many layers of security in place and to have the latest antivirus definitions that you're scanning and proactively scanning for and so on, whether you're a smaller firm or a big organization, having a business continuity disaster recovery plan so that when disaster strikes, you know what you're going to do is vital. But hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into really some of the methods that criminals use to actually get their payloads onto their victims' machines, and really the extent of these types of attacks. If you hadn't seen it in the news over the last few months, it really is something that it really needs to be taken seriously. But let me actually show you what this is like. What is it like to experience a ransomware attack? So this is a server that could be on your network providing some key tools to your business. In this particular role, this is a file server, so I've got some business documents on this server that my employees are using to do their jobs. And this server, it's running Windows Server 2012, which currently is the most popular server operating system. Obviously, we're starting to see a lot of organizations who do have older versions of Windows start to upgrade as part of their policy to make sure that they're running secure software and so on. And so this is a pretty good representation of what a lot of infrastructure that is out there in the real world driving businesses is actually going to look like. And this server has had a file saved on it by one of the employees in my organization that they think is a spreadsheet. So there's a spreadsheet in my downloads folder called payroll and bonuses.xlsx. Now, any educated user is immediately going to see that the icon for that file is not the icon for Microsoft Excel. It's not a spreadsheet. This is actually a malicious ransomware payload that's masquerading as a spreadsheet. Now, this particular payload doesn't use any tools to spoof the icon, but that's actually very easy to do, and we see a lot of attacks where they do try and trick users into running a malicious file. This is actually an executable, so a piece of software that has been uploaded to the server by one of my users. They think it's a legitimate file. Maybe it was emailed to them, maybe they found it on a flash drive in the car park, I don't know. Whatever method the criminals have used to actually get this payload, they succeeded in tricking that user into getting that piece of software onto that machine. This software hasn't been run yet. It's just sitting there as seemingly an innocent file. But all it takes is a user to actually double-click and open up that spreadsheet. That should immediately be a warning that this isn't a spreadsheet, this is an executable. But if you don't have that level of education as to what to look for, you're going to run it. And you'll notice it's immediately deleted itself. If we come back to my file, my document store here, the ransomware is now running on my system. It's installed itself. It's now scanning through the file system of this server. And there, do you see how long it took? Less than 30 seconds for this malicious piece of software to scan through my file system, find my data, and encrypt it. And so it's now encrypted all of the data on this server. Once it's finished encrypting everything else, it will then throw up a ransomware note, a ransomware message. And you probably would have seen screenshots of these types of messages reported in the news, especially after WannaCry. We saw photos of hospitals with these big red banners on it. So it's scanning through the rest of the file system now, and it even encrypts, doesn't just encrypt my data, it'll also encrypt things like my shortcuts. If I try and click on my web browser here, even the shortcut itself has been encrypted. But there's that ransomware note. Let's have a look at this. They've encrypted my data with 2,000-bit encryption. Now that is incredibly strong. Essentially they are using passwords that are thousands of characters long, to be able to scramble and protect my data. For a typical laptop like the ones behind me, so 2 processing cores, maybe 4 or 8 gigabytes of memory, it's going to take millions of years to break this encryption. And they are giving us 3 days before they'll delete the password that they've scrambled all of my data with. And so I essentially have 3 days to either pay them the money to try and get my data back, or find another solution. And you notice they've given us some instructions here to how to download an anonymous web browser and to then pay them in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency that essentially is a way of transferring funds completely anonymously. So, if you look at kind of in Hollywood, if someone gets kidnapped, the ransom note will be left, typically in an envelope or maybe a phone call, and then you have to come and bring a big duffel bag with all your dollar bills in it to a secret location, and then you make the exchange. And there's risk there for criminals. If criminals actually have to put themselves out in the real world, then there's a chance that they might get caught by security professionals and by the police. With this type of attack, and the instructions they've given us here, means that we can pay them in a way that cannot be traced. So even GCHQ and the FBI and the NSA, it's almost impossible for the best security professionals in the world to track down these types of criminal. So what are our options? Well, option one, pay the ransom. They're only asking for 1 Bitcoin here, and at the moment the Bitcoin to sterling exchange rate, I think it's about £2,000 per Bitcoin. It fluctuates an awful lot. So at the beginning of the year it was about 1,000. I think it peaked about £3,000 about a month ago, and it's come down a little. So they're not actually asking for that much money. A couple of £1,000, that's absorbable, as it were. But the problem with paying the ransom is that you're expecting a criminal to be true to his word, and then to give you the passphrase that's locking down all of your data. So you're expecting a criminal who has no incentive to actually give you your data back, to give you your data back. The other problem with paying the ransom is that even if you do pay the ransom, and even if the criminals do give you your encryption keys back, this malicious software is still on your machine. So yes, I can go and I can recover my files and my data, but I still then have to wipe this entire machine to get rid of all traces, because I don't know what hooks this has dug down into my servers and into my infrastructure. I still have to wipe my machine clean, then reinstall my operating system, reinstall my applications, then return my data in order to get complete guarantee that they haven't left any traces of this on my system, and then they're just going to hack me again after I've paid the ransom. So paying a ransom can only ever be the last of last resorts. What I'm about to show you is what we feel as a security vendor, Datto, and Taylormade certainly is one of our key partners, and they've actually chosen to use Datto's technology for a number of their customers. It gives you another option, and it's more than just backup, as you'll see. This is the interface of one of the solutions that, in fact, let's go this one here, it's a bit cleaner. This is the interface of the backup solution that's protecting this environment, and what I'm able to do is to, inside of just a few clicks and a few seconds, take my last backup of this server before that ransomware attack struck and recover my data from it. So this is the server we're going to recover, and you'll notice we have ransomware detection built into this solution, where we can look for signs of ransomware within the infection within backups. What I'm able to do is to essentially roll back to my last known point before the ransomware attack occurred. So what I'm doing is using some of this technology to take the backup of my server and to create a virtual server on the appliance that essentially allows me to keep running my business even though my actual server has been infected. That's probably one of the first things you want to do if you have been infected by, or you think you've got a ransomware infection, is to pull the network plugs on your machines to stop it from potentially spreading. But what I've just done, and whilst we've been up here and watching this, is taken a backup of my server, and I have allowed, and I'm now booting up that server on this backup appliance, and this will allow me to get all of my data back and to in fact continue running my business, allow my users to edit their files and so on in literally just a few seconds. So in a moment or two, this server will have finished booting. We'll then go to be able to log into it, and we'll see all of my server in the exact state it was before the ransomware attack occurred. So using this kind of tool and this type of technology, this is what business continuity is all about. It's more than just backing up your data. It's giving you a quick, agile way of recovering after a ransomware attack. This is not going to stop a ransomware attack from happening. To stop ransomware attacks from happening, you have to follow Matthew's advice in having all those layers of security and educating your users and so on. But eventually, you are going to be compromised. The nature of these attacks is that it's becoming increasingly easy, and when that time comes, you need to have a solution that will allow you to minimize the impact to your business. If I log in here, this is my server exactly as it was just before that ransomware attack. And if I open up, there's all of my data before the ransomware attack occurred. And how long has that taken us? Literally 2 to 3 minutes. I'm able to roll my server back to essentially a previous point in time before the ransomware attack occurred, run my server on my disaster recovery solution, and that then allows me to pick up the phone to Taylormade and say, Taylormade, please come and help me out. I've been affected with ransomware, and so on. So really, that's the key message, is that it's becoming increasingly easy for criminals to leverage a number of different attack vectors. And no matter how many layers of security you have, criminals are always going to try and stay one step ahead. And this type of tool that allows you in literally just 2 or 3 minutes to roll back to before your ransomware attack struck, allow you to keep your business running, this is what business continuity is all about. It's more than just backup, it's protecting you from downtime as well as potential data loss from ransomware attacks. And with that, I'm going to pass on over to our next speaker, but thank you very much for your time.
I'm going to talk about data protection, which is, I know, the highlight of the morning session for you all. But before I do that, I just want to pick up on some things Matthew said. I've worked in IT for longer than I care to admit, certainly before the dawn of the commercial internet. And it used to be even 5 years ago that everyone pretended there was no such thing as data breach or cyber attacks. And companies suffered problems, kept their head down, tried to solve it, paid the ransomware, whatever it was. We're all far too aware now of the problems. And one of the ideas behind Cybersecure South was by coming together and sharing knowledge and experiences and best practice. That was one of our best ways of ensuring that as different sectors and industries we can be better prepared. So in that light, and having emphasized the importance of training, I want to turn that around and then emphasize the importance of the technical solution. We are constantly under cyber attack as a law firm. We have client accounts, we process and handle a great deal of money. We had 2 occasions in the past year, both of which were intercepted and stopped, but both of which led us to escalate the level of tech solution that we deploy. One was the very idea, we had actually one of our IT specialists was doing research on a website. Everything looked fine, clicked on a link, immediately, fortunately, identified there was a problem happening and was able to isolate the machine she was on. Otherwise, we would have had our entire system encrypted. We also had the email, the phishing email that Matthew referred to, where our FD received an email from our CEO saying, need to do this transfer of money. It was a fairly modest amount. It wasn't, the amount wouldn't have necessarily flagged up. Now, our FD is extremely well educated in the people risk and the tech risk in cybersecurity. He checked everything. The email looked right. It wasn't a spoofed email address. But there was one thing that caught his eye, that made him double check, triple check, is that the email ended thanks. And our CEO is a great guy, but he's a very busy man and he rarely ends his emails with a thank you. So it was just that small thing that caught the eye of someone, one of the most educated people in our firm about the risks of a dodgy email, that enabled us to prevent or to avoid falling victim to that scam. As a result of which, we implemented pretty much all the measures Matthew talked about, including web content control, which for people like Rebecca Weston, my colleague here, and I who work in the tech sector, was a little frustrating at first. But we adapted, and actually, I think it's about 20 minutes we can get a website vetted and cleared if it's not on our whitelist. If you think any of these tech solutions are just going to be a burden in your business, I just want to emphasize the burden of not having them in place is going to be much greater. And as I say, our experience was we adapted, and now it's part of the course for us. We don't even notice that we have these extra controls in. Okay, so how do I segue this into data protection? It's simple. You will not comply with the new data protection law if you do not have your cybersecurity up to date to the technological investment level that would be reasonable of a company of your particular size. And now it doesn't matter, therefore, how big your company is. The tools available, the education available in dealing with cybersecurity, which is essential to data privacy management, means that you are pretty much going to be legally bound to make investments. Because if you don't, and you suffer a data breach, the fines, up to 2% realistically of turnover, but certainly in the tens of thousands quite easily, will be significant. If you ever want to know how big the fines are these days, just go on the Information Commissioner Officer's website, and they happily publish them. And it's hundreds of thousands of pounds, or in the case of one small hairdresser's, something like £7,500 for mishandling a customer data list. So, where's my clicky thing? Do I do this? Is it up?
Yeah, you'll have to go through my slides, I'm afraid. I was running from my machine.
Okay, hang on. Oh yeah, okay. So, what is the GDPR? Well, it's basically a single data protection law, piece of legislation for the entire European Union. And before you sort of catch your breath and think, Brexit, don't worry about it, the government's already published proposals to adopt GDPR into national law following Brexit Day. And commercially, if you have any kind of trade with Europe, you're going to have to sign up in your contracts to comply with European Union data protection law. So we're stuck with it, whatever your views on Brexit. I'm not going to give you a detail on data protection law. I'm just going to concentrate on those things which are new and the particular challenges, the things which are new oppose you. The basic premise behind the GDPR is what we now call privacy by design. Matthew mentioned security by design, which has been a totem in the security field. In engineering, safety by design. Well, this has very much been adopted now. And the idea is that instead of asking, how can I get hold of loads of data about customers or contacts? How can I use it, to the greatest benefit of my business, and comply with the law? You start with asking, how can I ensure the security of any data I hold, and how can I ensure I only use it for purposes for which I have authority? If you start with that premise, privacy, at the outset, you'll go a long way towards being able to move forward to compliance with GDPR. There are particular new additional obligations on any company handling data, and I just think let's comply. Yeah, I'm going to skip that second slide. Sorry, I just want to jump over that one. It's not possibly relevant. So, okay, I'm going to go on to what's new. The first one, you may have heard about this idea of the data protection officer. Now, the legislation is a little bit vague as to when you have to have a data protection officer. It's not obligatory for every company, though it is certainly considered best practice. Certainly, probably the guiding rule would be if you are processing data of more than 5,000 subjects, you're more likely than not to need a data protection officer. And that person needs to have sufficient seniority to report directly to the board, have sufficient independence from the board, to have sufficient funding, be able to carry out their job of ensuring that your business is compliant. If you're a group of companies, you can have one DPO for the entire group. So the key thing there is that you must have board level seniority, not necessarily on the board, and you must fund them. You must allow them to actually carry out a compliance role within your business. The second very important change is that if you're a data processor, rather than just a data controller, you have direct legal obligations to comply with data privacy law. Now, a data controller, for those of you not familiar with the terms, is the company who is actually benefiting from the data. So if you're a company that sells to customers, your customer list, you are the data controller. In these days, when we use many third parties, any company that processes that data, typically a marketing company, sends out communications for you, is the data processor. And it used to be, as long as the data processor only did what the controller told them, the data processor had no direct liability. That's changed now. The data processor themselves have direct responsibility to ensure that, for example, if they're emailing out marketing material, that their controller had consent from those email subjects to receive the communication. So that's quite a significant change. If you process data on behalf of other people, you also have to look to ensure that your controller has complied with the law. The other very big change is there is a legal obligation now, if you suffer a data breach, to notify the ICO. Now, I said earlier that actually companies are now much more open, and just for reputational management reasons, will be more open about having suffered a data breach. But there is a legal obligation. You have to report. Is it 24, 48 hours, Rebecca?
24.
Within 24 hours, you have to report a data breach. Now, that's quite... if you're in a consumer-facing business, or even if you're in a particularly sensitive industry, the concern about reputation management is often a brake on being public about suffering a data breach. But you now have a legal obligation to do so. Not doing so will lead to fines. Consent is one of the big changes. I'm going to go into the next slide to show you this consent. This is the new legal definition of what consent. And I'm going to read it because I just want to emphasize this is a bit of a typical Euro legislation. Any freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous indication of his or her wishes by which the data subject, either by a statement or by a clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to process data relating to personal data relating to them being processed. Now, even for a lawyer, that's quite a mouthful. What it means is that quite a considerable amount of the personal data you hold, you will probably no longer be able to process in the ways you previously have, because you've almost certainly not received sufficient consent from those data subjects to comply with the requirements of the GDPR. I'll give you a couple of examples. These days, what counts as consent? You tick a box. We are going to use your data to do this, to communicate with you, to introduce, vetted, trusted third parties. Yes, that's fine. If the data subject specifically uses their browser settings to confirm the release of data, or that to accept downloading cookies or so on, if they specifically choose browser settings, that would constitute consent. If they make any other kind of affirmative statement, that could be at the point of sale, they tick a box, they sign a box. We're still advising, if you say clicking on this OK button means that we can use your data in a certain way, that will count as consent. Well, what you can't anymore do is the pre-tick box. You just have the soft opt-in, the opt-out. From now on, any box where you require the specific ticking of the box must be open. The default is no consent. Rather confusingly, which is why the whole browser settings things, my advice to clients is just ignore that aspect of consent, is that if the data subject has just relied on their default browser settings, that is not an affirmative, direct, specific action to confirm consent. Therefore, legally, it doesn't count. So there's a bit of sort of, that's an option within the consent rules now, which I suspect is of no great significance. Most importantly, silence. Not objecting to how you use data is not consent. One of the consequences of this is that most of your privacy statements, where you're disclosing how you're going to use data, possibly are still, if you've had them updated, that's great, but are possibly still on the old style where you bundle up a whole list of things you want to use the data for. That's no longer sufficient, because you cannot rely on someone, A, reading a whole long-winded, bundled list of consent you're asking for. You have to be specific. So for each and every specific use you want to make of someone's data, you need them to make an affirmative action to signify their consent. The simple approach we're taking now is just look again at your privacy statements, your data use policies, split them down into appropriate categories and get specific consents. If you're an online business, that's really frustrating because that's slowing down your user engagement. But that's what you will require now to be compliant with the new legislation. Okay, so let's assume you've got consent. The key thing is data subject can withdraw their consent at any time. They can withdraw specific consents. I talked about breaking it down, so it's several ticks rather than just one. They can withdraw individual consents. They say, yes, you can use my email to contact me about your products. I don't want to hear about your partner products anymore. Just to note there, the exemptions remain where you have to communicate with them or use their data in order to deliver the service or so on. That's fine. We are primarily here talking about the enhanced use you make of data subject information, and that's primarily in the field of promoting new products and services or introducing them, and certainly in the case if you are reselling and trading their data. So I talked about data protection. Does that come up? Yeah, data protection by design, and I always struggle with this word, pseudonymization. This is actually, now I'm going to come back to the tech solution here. If any of you have ever been involved in selling a business under TUPE and you have to disclose your employee list of potential buyer, you'll know that under the current law, you have to send them an anonymized list. So you don't have a list of names and job titles and salaries, employee 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to call it anonymization light because I can say that. The principle now is when you process data even internally, you must anonymize it as far as possible. So for example, and this is the law, the actual implementation and the practicalities of it is something that's probably going to take several years to develop. But in principle, what the law says, let's say you have a payroll company who is just calculating tax and benefits. When you send them the salary list, you have to send it under an anonymized list. rather than connect that personal data to the employee name. You only at the last minute, when you print the payroll, should you bring the name and the salary details together. Now, within your own business, I'll let you start imagining how that approach may be relevant to the different ways in which you process data. One of the biggest challenges under GDPR is that the way people process and handle data in their own businesses is currently almost certainly no longer compliant, or won't be in May 2018 when this comes into effect. Because you have to think the privacy by design approach plus anonymization light, pseudonymization, means you have to think about how you structure and hold data within your business. And what that means is where you have many different aspects of data which brought together identify a living human being, which is the definition of personal data, the key piece of information, the name, the address, you have to keep separate from the rest. And you have to process data on an anonymized basis and only bring it together when you have to. Now, in terms of how you're structuring databases and where on the server you hold it, and indeed, the more sensitive the data, the greater the level of encryption and protection you have to give to it, so that if you do suffer a data breach, the most sensitive data is the hardest to get hold of. Excepting you also have to have a pretty good standard of protection for all the data you hold. So it's quite a large technical challenge. In terms of policies and procedures, that's as important and is actually required now by law. And here's another one, staff training. You are required to do staff training. If you are not doing staff training in handling data, in ensuring data privacy, ensuring the data is used only for authorized purposes, and you suffer a data breach because one of your employees or even a contractor used data in a way that wasn't authorized, you will be liable. You can't just say, oh, that person acted without authority. Well, that person wasn't trained. There was a business, you are liable. As I mentioned earlier, the fines are going up all the time. Other changes, and all of these come back to you have to know where your data is, how you manage it, and you have to be able to strip any particular piece of data out of your system. You've heard about the right to be forgotten. That was bandied around several years ago. People wanted to be able to remove their name or stories about them on the whole internet. But as a global right, that didn't quite make it through. But what we do have is the right to erasure. Data subject can withdraw consent to you holding their data at any time, in part or in whole. So if they say, I don't want you holding data about me, and you have no legal exemption reason for doing so, for example, they're a customer, you're providing a service to them, you have to be able to delete all their data from your systems. Failure to do so is a breach. I don't know if anyone's ever received a subject access request, an SAR, which is where someone asks you, can you provide all the data you hold about me? Currently, I think you can charge a very minor, modest fee of about £10. That's being abolished, which means, and expect a spike in people making requests, because people are always trying out the new law when it comes into effect. Expect a spike in people asking, what personal data do you hold against me? Some of these will just be activists, just testing you out. Some will just be people they've heard, they'll have to find out what data you hold. You have to be able to produce in a very reasonable amount of time the data you hold about them. And you can't charge them for it. You have to bear that cost yourself. So if your data isn't well managed and structured internally, you're not going to be able to comply with that request. And not being able to comply with that request itself will lead to a fine. And then possibly an audit to determine whether your data practices are actually compliant with the law. And not being compliant with the law may also lead to a fine. The final point there on that slide is this idea of portability of personal data. If you have personal data about somebody, you have to be able to give it to them in a format that they can take, that's portable. So if you're using a very archaic system in terms of the database in which you store the data, you send them a file that they seriously can't reasonably be expected to be able to read, you're going to have to convert that data into a format they can read. So again, if you haven't updated your systems recently, that's something you should start looking at. Right, now it all seems like a bit, good Lord, where do we start in all this? In your packs, we've produced this little guide. This isn't about data law, this is about implementing, assessing your systems and implementing from a data point of view, understanding where your data is, how you hold it, what reasons you hold it for, and identifying what data you may no longer be entitled to hold after May 2018. we've developed a tool which you can request to, I don't think I put it up there, gdpr.coffeemew.co.uk. It's a very detailed, long questionnaire. It's designed to, as you work through it, to help you think through and identify where you hold data, what policies you have, how do you match data to the consent you may hold. That's absolutely free to use. There's absolutely no obligation to come and talk to us ever again. You're free to, if you want a copy of that questionnaire, if it's useful, use it with other advisors. We're quite happy to just share this as a tool for everyone. And in the spirit of GDPR, if you contact the email address, we won't be used for any other reason other than to send you the questionnaire. Included in this guide is, we've got a roadmap which my colleague Rebecca West has developed. Between now and May, 9 months or so, is adequate time if you start to do those assessments and start figuring out how to adapt to GDPR. Now, it used to be, some years ago, the Information Commissioner was quite happy if you were trying to comply with data protection law, as it is now, as it was then. And as long as you engaged and were making an effort, you generally avoided being fined. The ICO has made it perfectly clear now, and I mentioned they regularly post the fines they issue. Just trying isn't good enough anymore. You have to really be taking this stuff seriously. But provided you are taking it seriously, provided you are taking the steps, there is notwithstanding the May deadline, most companies are only starting now to assess how they hold data, whether they have consents. So if you start now, whether you use our tool or any other approach you take, you are perfectly capable of, as far as possible, getting lined up for GDPR in May next year. You certainly need to be talking to your IT teams and your finance teams about their whole data. And I'll just leave you with a primer that when you talk to your marketing people, expect jaws to hit the floor when you tell them they're probably going to have to delete half the marketing data they're holding. Because if you can't match those prospect lists, those target lists, those customer lists to a specific consent to send the marketing data, not only can you not send the marketing data, you almost certainly probably have to delete it from your system as well. So there's a bit of a hygiene audit that needs to be carried out. If you carry that out, if you can say why you hold data, if you can show you have consent for holding that data, and you have the proper tech systems in place to protect that data to the extent that's reasonable given the current state of the art, then you'll be in pretty good shape in May next year.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Simon Dixon. I'm the Head of Development for Portmore Insurance Brokers. We are a commercial insurance broker in Southampton, and we've been working with Taylormade on a number of these cyber presentations over the last sort of 6 or 7 months. And before I start, I just want to say thank you to Matt and particularly to Tim for scaring the willy out of just about everybody in the room. Because their job is to show you some of the dangers. My job, hopefully, is to give you some assurance that actually you can do something about this in terms of an insurance protection going forward. But with all of these things, insurance protection really should be the last resort in a risk management structure. So you start up here and look at all the risks that are associated with your business, and eventually you put lots of systems in place, lots of checks in place, and you get to a point where the risks associated with your business can either be just managed internally or transferred in the same way through the purchase of an insurance program. And today, really, my session is talking about some of the options that are available to you in the insurance market. Now, before I does anybody actually currently buy cyber insurance? Okay, good. It's a fairly new thing. I think clients, it would be fair to say, are dipping their toes in the water in terms of the purchase. The principle of it'll never happen to me. That's why for every presentation I'm now going to take Tim out with me. Answer 3 questions. Do you hold customer data? Do you have a website? Do you rely on a computer system to conduct your business? I think everybody in this room would say yes to all three of those. Yeah? Therefore, you are at risk, and therefore you have potential to protect yourselves. I'm going to skip over the numbers. We've probably done stats to death. But I just wanted to highlight this, and I think this picks up on some things that Matt talked about earlier. So we've seen that nearly 75% of all cyber threats come from human error. If you take nothing away from my presentation, remember the acronym PICNIC: problem in chair, not in computer. 75% of the time, it's one of your employees clicking on a link, opening an email that's got some spurious links in there, as Tim has already showed you. Clicking on those links, hitting your ransom. Now, interestingly, 25% of ransoms paid by insurers. The depressing side of the insurance industry is often it is actually cheaper to pay the ransom than it is to deal with the associated costs of bringing a professional in to try and see how deep the intervention has become and the cost associated with that. It's often cheaper for insurers to do that. Now, that may change as the purchase of cyber protection insurance goes up. Criminals will get wise of this, and you might not see the 1 Bitcoin. It might be suddenly 10 Bitcoins. That's the ransom. So what's actually available to you? You can purchase a very fairly low limit of up to 100,000, but all the way up to £5 million worth of cover. And essentially, this is the costs associated with the actual attack. This isn't designed to cover the financial loss that you suffer, that somebody's managed to get hold of your bank account and money's disappeared from your bank account. That's a different cover altogether. These are the costs associated with understanding how your breach has happened and how deep have you gone. So we cover breach costs. So that is to bring in a specialist, a forensic investigation in to look at your system, understand how deep they've gone, how much it's affected your system, has it now affected your customers' systems, and the costs associated with notifying your customers that there's been a breach, potentially notifying regulators that there's been a breach. Crisis containment cover. This is disaster recovery plan really in action. This is getting a specialist in to help you in the immediate days, in the aftermath of a breach, to manage that crisis. It's about managing your reputation. So Tim talked about the NHS breaches not so long ago, and they will have had people coming in to help manage that reputational damage that breach causes. Cyber business interruption insurance. So all through a period of a cyber attack where your systems are down, your business is potentially losing income that they would have earned had that cyber attack not happened. The intention there is to provide you with the cover of that loss of income and that loss of revenue. Cyber extortion. So Tim's presentation showed you the big red box with the countdown clock. That's really about the costs associated with that and ensuring that, and that can be anything from 2 up to 25,000. We've seen examples of the damage that the actual hacker themselves costs. So the damage, the costs associated with bringing your IT specialists in or bringing an external consultant in to repair that damage. to replace some of the equipment that potentially has been damaged beyond repair, damaged your websites. All of that has a cost associated which you can protect against. The privacy protection is to pay any potential claims that you may have against you by a customer if your breach rather has let their data be exposed as well. So you could be sued by that customer. And then your multimedia liability. If you mistakenly infringe copyright law, you are potentially exposed, and again, that is cover that's available to you. You can also provide cover for cybercrime. So we talked about the costs associated thus far, and the best way of showing you this is by way of an example. I have a client who's a construction company who every week they pay their subcontractors on a Wednesday. Friday afternoon, about 10 to 5, one of their largest subcontractors rang them to say, we've not had our payment through. I get a phone call on the Monday morning, the worst type of phone call you can imagine. 10 to 9, Monday morning, we've had a problem. Essentially what had happened, their accounts lady had opened an email. They'd managed to get access to her computer, change the spreadsheet that had bank account details and sort codes, change those round. She'd sent it to the MD. The MD took a cursory look at it, looked at the names, looked at the numbers, and thought, yeah, they're about right. He uploaded it onto his online banking system, and the money had disappeared. And he lost 2 payments, one at $45,000 and one at $6,000. The bank managed to stop the $6,000, but the $45,000 had already gone. Now, because he'd uploaded it onto his system, onto the online banking system, the bank said, there's nothing we can do about it. And that's what cybercrime is there to protect them against, that financial loss, so that £45,000. You can also provide insurance protection for phone hacking. So this is where companies abroad get access to your phone systems and suddenly run up astronomical phone bills because they're calling all over the world. Ultimately, this is about putting you back in the position that you would have been in had you not had the loss. So that's it from me, really. I think we're back now to the panel. So opening up for questions. Stunned silence.
I've got on the GDPR piece, just in terms of policy, I mentioned around the marketing team's jaws dropping, just sort of ducks in a row and things. When we're talking to the marketing team, the affirmative action piece does apply to anything that was collected prior to the May 18 implementation of GDPR. So we need to demonstrate that they've made affirmative action to prove their consent for each individual thing they're using that data for prior to May 18.
Well, on the 28th of May, you need to show that you've got the specific consent for the uses you're making of it.
When we collected it in...
yeah, it doesn't matter when you collected it. It's the data you hold at that point has to be compliant with the requirements. So what that means is, this week, there's other legislation here, as one car company discovered. You can use the current period until May to re-engage with customers, but you have to be mindful to ensure that you have consent to engage with them under the current legislation, because we still have under the Electronic Communications Directive, if you spam them with unsolicited commercial mail, then you can still be subject to a fine for infringing that legislation. So if you are re-engaging with a database you have of people who've expressed an interest in your products or customers, ensure that you are limiting the communication to checking that they want to hear from you in the future. Don't use it as an excuse to try and sell some other services to them at the same time, because you may find yourself infringing current legislation. But generally speaking, as long as you are, I would say that the approach to take is take the presumption that you're going to delete the data. This is generally the advice I've been giving. So if you have a list of customers and you are broadly confident that you have the right to communicate with them, I mean, being realistic, you won't necessarily every single line item on the list be able to confirm consent. But if you send them and tell them we are going to delete your data unless you tell us you want us to retain it for any of these reasons, and then delete that data, that is not an unreasonable approach to take to your data hygiene. Don't use it as an excuse to try and offer them goods and services, though. That could be shooting yourself in the foot.
Question on GDPR. If you just deal with companies, is someone's email address personal data?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I know that we often think personal data is about individuals, consumers. No, any data which can be used to identify a living human being is personal data. That is the only test.
Under the way you have to report a breach, is there any ramifications for organisations who identify vulnerabilities in software and reporting that back to the software vendors? So like the WannaCry was an XP vulnerability at the NSA, whereas global, surely there's some kind of claim from the NHS back to the NSA to say, well, you developed and designed this, you spotted it and didn't tell the rest of the world.
I think that's where the phrase sovereign immunity may come in place.
Is there any kind of reporting requirements around?
There's no reporting requirements if you spot a vulnerability. I'd certainly advise you report it back. If you're obviously in tech, then you'll know where to do it. But if you think, you should. The point, I think, the whole point of Cybersecure South is share things you identify, because it's like vaccination, isn't it? It's a bit contentious term sometimes, but by sharing what you've discovered about vulnerabilities with the sector, with tech specialists, you'll get the benefit of other people doing it. This is, I think, the point I made, and perhaps a personal view, but being more open that this is a very real problem. It's out there. It's not going to go away. And just, and what benefit could any company have by having spotted a vulnerability, not passing that up to their tech specialists and putting it back into the industry?
A lot of organisations actually have what they call bug bounties, where if you report a bug, they'll pay you. So it's, but I think it's an interesting thing within the whole industry is that the NSA didn't disclose that they had these loopholes for very good reasons, that they're using it to keep us all safe, in theory. But on the flip side, Microsoft reduced support for Windows XP 3 years ago, so any organisation still using that were doing so under the knowledge that they were using an unsupported operating system. So it's always going to be that game of making sure you're staying up to date, but it's a difficult one to try and predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, if I understand it correctly, a lot of the NHS, because they hadn't patched the vulnerabilities, fell victim to WannaCry. And the point I made for GDPR compliance, if you're not patching, if you're not taking those security updates, then you are negligent. And if you suffer a breach, a data privacy breach, because you didn't patch a vulnerability that you knew about or should have known about, then you are at risk of being fined. Do we have any other questions?
On the way you have to consent, lots of people now, you normally have like 1 or 2 boxes and you probably have a glance and read of those. Where the GDPR is now going to specify you have to have a lot more. Is there not just a risk that people are just going to be even more tick?
Yes, and this unfortunately is where there's another word in that long list, that definition I gave you, informed consent. It's not enough to get your lawyer to do some clever, long-winded thing, because actually, we all know no one's actually reading it. And since your customers or the people who tick the box haven't really read it and understand it, you could be charged saying you didn't really get conformed consent. You structured the user experience of your website that it just almost happened by default. That's not taking the requirements seriously. In fact, people are now looking at very different ways of engaging with data subjects. One is using a video, actually talking to them, having someone on face explaining this is what we're going to do, tick box A. So you can start to reimagine different ways now of engaging, but the onus is on the business to satisfy the regulator, the ICO, that the data subjects understood the consent they were giving, and it was specific and it was freely given. So
at the moment, there's no guidance on that. It's all test cases
It will be, well, I mean, we've known this for 2 years in the past. First year was, well, let's just get the legal sector to figure out what we think are the real extents of this legislation. But it is going to be down to business now, because it's really about business, and it's about ensuring business can engage in a meaningful way with business users to think of better ways of getting consent. And I suppose, and the upside from that is that you have better engagement when you do communicate with these data subjects. So it's not all doom and gloom. If you think about it, a more meaningful, informed engagement with the people with whom you communicate, that's a good guide, I think. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time this morning. We really appreciate you coming along. We hope you found it useful, and I think we're all hanging around for a bit. If anyone wants a word in private or just to talk about any of these points any further. So thank you very much.